Good afternoon and welcome to Capital Account. I'm Lauren Lister here in Washington, D.C. The Eurozone today still appears to be a danger zone as Italian bond yields surpassed 7% for the second time in 6 days. And Italy's largest bank tries to raise billions of dollars to weather the storm of exposure. The EU also tries to curb ratings agencies. Are these all signs the Eurozone has been one big failure? Well, we speak to a member of European Parliament who certainly thinks so. And in the U.S., Occupy Wall Street cleared out of Zuccotti Park by riot cops, a day after Occupy Oakland was cleared out by cops, too. If you were an investor, would you be wishing you could go long police raids? Well, since you can't, we'll talk about who is benefiting. And on the Hill, lawmakers meet about Obama's policy toward Iran. Now, we've heard the rhetoric escalate lately, so from weapons sales to lobbyists, we look at who's capitalizing on the U.S.'s tensions with the country. Let's get to Capital Account. As I mentioned, the Eurozone is still a danger zone. Here is the evidence. Italian bond yields reached 7%. I want you to remember, that's the threshold that broke the bank for Greece and for Ireland last year. We have seen Italy surpass that twice in just a few days. Now, also, Italy's largest bank, if you're measuring it by assets, and one of the more weakly capitalized in all of Europe, it's called UniCredit. It's announced it's going to try to raise $10 billion in capital and cut thousands of jobs. It suffered some losses from Greece, from haircuts. Now, it also sounds like the European Union is going after the credit ratings agencies. They want to allow investors to sue them, and they want them to warn bond issuers of a change in ratings ahead of publishing it. Now, the solution to the Eurozone's problems, the task at hand, according to Angela Merkel of Germany, is this. The task of our generation is to complete economic and monetary union and build political union in Europe, step by step. That does not mean less Europe. It means more Europe. That's something she just said at the annual conference of her political party. But au contraire, said my guest, Nigel Farage, he is a European member of Parliament. To call him a Eurosceptic is to put it lightly. He is talking about a year ago about this in Parliament. I want to play you a little bit of what he said.
Increasingly, people are saying, we don't want that flag, we don't want the anthem, we don't want this political class, we want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history.
I spoke to him today, and I asked him for us to go to that dustbin of history. Because Europe, before the EU, saw centuries of conflict and war and famine. The EU was the first real attempt to unify the continent through diplomacy instead of war. So I asked him, is there nothing that should be salvaged of the last 60 years of integration? Here's what he said.
Well, don't forget that communism was supposed to make the lot of ordinary people better, and in Soviet Russia it made it increasingly worse, and the European Union was based on the fact that France and Germany fought each other in 3 vicious wars in the space of 60 years, and the idea was if you abolish nation states, suddenly everybody will be at peace with each other if they're unified under one flag. We seem to have forgotten. We did this in the early 1920s with the Balkans. We called it Yugoslavia, and that broke apart in violent conflict. You cannot create a United States of Europe without the consent of the people. That consent has never been sought. So what we should be doing, if we want to make sure that Europe is free from wars and free from some of those awful conflicts that we've seen, is to make sure that we foster democracy. Democratic, mature European nation states do not go to war with each other. And what we are now doing is we're imposing upon people, through the euro and other measures, a new political union that is undesired, unwanted, and what's happened just in the last few months is many of the old enmities have flared up again. We're headed in the wrong direction.
I don't want to get more to that, but I want to bring up then another concern that was that the EU was born out of, and that was, of course, to contain Germany after the devastation it caused in World War II. You say that mature democracies don't go to war, but you, as an opponent of federalism, aren't you afraid of Germany? And when I say that, I don't mean literally Germany, perhaps. I mean the reemergence of a player like that who tries to use force for control on the continent.
There has not been, since 1945, any public appetite or any public figure in Germany that has suggested that they should invade other states, that has been keen on remilitarizing. I mean, actually, I think much of this is actually rather insulting to Germany. Yes, they did some ghastly things. I don't think since 1945 there has been a more peace-loving country in the world than Germany. Ironically, what has happened through the Euro project, because the Germans are really rather efficient, are very good at industry and manufacturing, ironically, economically, they are now taking over the whole of the Eurozone. And I think Mrs. Merkel finds herself a somewhat reluctant top dog and boss in Europe today.
But as far as just, I didn't mean necessarily Germany specifically, but more broadly, the reemergence of a player like that who tries to use force for control on the continent. You're not afraid of that at all if there's disintegration?
Look. When you strip from people democracy, when you take away from people their ability through the ballot box to determine their own future, you leave them with only one option, and that option is civil disobedience or civil disorder. And I am very strongly of the thought that if we continue with this project, trying politically to unify all these countries under a government that we can't even elect and we can't even get rid of, that people will take matters into their own hands. So far from this leading to peace and harmony, it's actually doing the opposite, and it will see, and it's beginning to see already, the re-emergence of the very extreme nationalisms that caused the problem in the first place. This is not going to work. If we want to have a Europe of trade, democracy, cooperation, but that being done by sovereign governments, hard and fired, by their own people, well, that is a perfectly reasonable proposition. But the idea, you know, that a country like mine gives away control of its parliament to people like Mr. Barroso and Herman Van Rompuy, people we can't vote for, I'm sorry, it's just not acceptable.
And you think this is headed further in the wrong direction, but I want to talk about a disintegration scenario and how you envision the next 10 to 20 years if that does happen. As far as the reemergence of old divides, the emergence of new divides, it's something you're kind of touching upon, but what will the next 10 to 20 years actually look like?
Well, the irony, of course, is that the euro is making the Greeks slag off the Germans. You know, they're burning European flags in Athens with swastikas drawn on them. There are cartoons appearing in Greek newspapers of Angela Merkel wearing swastikas and Nazi uniforms. And in Germany, you get the tabloid press in Germany saying that the Greeks are corrupt, lazy and useless. So actually what the euro is doing, it's making us all dislike each other very much more than before. Where are we going from here? I mean, look, those Mediterranean countries were never ever going to fit into an economic and monetary union with countries like the Netherlands and Germany. We are now seeing the price of that. Countries that are trapped inside a currency that is probably 60 to 70% overvalued for their needs, and they're now being told, when they've already got an economy that is decreasing at a rate of 5% a year, they must take further massive austerity measures. The Eurozone, as it's currently constructed, is going to break up. The only question is, does it break up in a disorderly fashion, or does it break up in an orderly fashion? And what we are urging here is that if we really were good Europeans, we'd be helping Greece to go back to the drachma, to get a devaluation, to stop massive capital flight from that country. I want to see an orderly breakup of the euro, but at the moment, nobody here can admit they've got it wrong, and they're doing everything they can to maintain this project.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because you're actually one of the few people who are very vocal about actual ways that countries could exit the euro. So specifically, how do you see this happening?
Well, I mean, I've been urging the bosses in Europe for the last year and more, please can we have a plan B? Please can we have a contingency plan? Now, you know, we've started some work on this. We held a conference here a month ago with a couple of senior German economists putting forward ideas as to how we can help Greece, Portugal and other countries get back to their own currencies. There's been a big prize put up of $250,000 for somebody that can find the right solution. There is still a lot of work to do on this, but I think we need to urgently focus on it because it's increasingly clear that what we're doing, you know, we're crucifying Greece. We're leading to, you know, a huge level of civil disorder, and something's got to be done. So I haven't yet got the perfect solution, but I'm trying to find it.
Is there anything you can tell us? Because just obviously the mainstream kind of consensus is that any kind of exit from the euro would be very disorderly, would be chaotic, would be horrible. So is there anything you can point us to specifically for an exit from the euro?
Well, if we carry on down the current route, we're going to find the markets overwhelming us with questions now being asked about Italy, potential questions being asked about France and its AAA rating. So the current course we're headed down is the one that will lead to real chaos. For Greece to get back to her own currency, I'm afraid banks in France and Germany and the UK are going to effectively have to write off the debt and give Greece a blank sheet of paper. Yes, it will cost us money in the short term, but to give Greece a devaluation of 60 or 70%, to give Greece the opportunity to get back to a form of democratic government that they might have some respect for, I think is the only possible route.
I just want to quickly ask you, obviously you're sitting in the UK, obviously the European and Eurozone crisis is top of mind for you, but sitting here in the United States, obviously a lot of similarities in terms of debt, a lot of similarities in terms of just obviously our economies are very much intertwined. Do you see any lessons for the United States in all of this?
No, not really. I think you've made your own mistakes. Just as in many ways in Europe we have. It was you guys that, under Greenspan and Clinton, got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. We did much the same. We've made catastrophic errors with our banking industry. Our governments have worked on the basis that you can go on borrowing forever. The day of reckoning is nigh. And I have to say, when I look at Mr. Obama, he just doesn't seem to recognize that national debt is a serious issue in America, just as it is in Europe. We haven't got governments that are realistic. We haven't got governments that are being truthful, frankly, with the people. There is worse to come. There are very hard times ahead. But at least America, it's a democratic state, and at least you've got the chance to vote for a different president if you want one. The poor people of Greece have got nothing like that.
We also have an expansion of executive powers in our country as well, but it sounds like a plague on both of our houses. I appreciate you being on this show, Mr. Farage.
Thank you very much.
Now, our interview did not end there. I continued talking to Nigel Farage, and you can watch our entire interview online at youtube.com/capitalaccount. You'll definitely want to check it out. We talked more about Europe and also the UK, where he hails from. So go to our website and watch that. And still ahead, right here on Capital Account, don't go away. Police may have cleared out Zuccotti Park and Occupy Oakland camps, but who stands to benefit from these police raids? We'll tell you after the break, but first, your closing stock numbers.
We just put a picture of me when I was like 9 years old on To Tell the Truth.
I have a confession. I am a total ghetto princess. I love rap and hip-hop music and Christian music.
I thought he was kind of a dick yesterday.
I'm very proud of the role that Al Jazeera has played.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Tom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
What drives the world?
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
Welcome back. Time now for Word of the Day, where I break down a financial term or concept for our very smart viewer, but maybe not the financial expert in our audience. And today it is technocrat. And we've been talking about how technocrats are in charge now in Rome and Athens. And here's one other reason why you need to know about what exactly this means. Here's a headline that we saw today. Let's see it. Letting technocrats run Europe is bad politics and bad economics. Okay, whoa, so just what is a technocrat that this guy's railing against? Well, here is the definition. It is someone who is selected through bureaucratic processes, and that's the key, on the basis of specialized knowledge and performance rather than a democratic or popular election. In a technocracy, decision makers would be selected based upon how knowledgeable and skillful they are in their field. So let's talk about technocrats and who these guys are in Europe right now. So in Italy, you have this guy, Mario Monti. He's the new prime minister. He replaces Berlusconi. Now, he's not a politician like Berlusconi. He's an economist and former commissioner of the European Union. He's also the current European chairman of the Trilateral Commission. And in Greece, who has replaced Prime Minister Papandreou as the head of the unity government, it's a technocrat, Lucas Papademos. This guy here, he is former central banker. He was a vice president of the European Central Bank and former governor of the Bank of Greece. So these guys weren't elected by the citizens of the countries to serve in parliament, and that's the key. As to whether countries are better off being ruled by unelected bureaucrats, which are technocrats, or democratically elected leaders, you can decide that. But now you know what a technocrat is. Occupy Wall Street, after spreading across the country over 60 days, which we have covered extensively on this show. Of course, they're protesting the inequality in this country, bank bailouts, other economic conditions, too. As I said, after 60 days, they've seen a crackdown. Zuccotti Park, home of Occupy Wall Street itself, was cleared out this morning by riot police. And yesterday, hundreds of police in riot gear dismantled Occupy Oakland camp, arresting protesters there, too. Now, despite all this, the movement continues. Here you can see, we're going to show you some protesters in New York, which have continued marching on Canal Street. So they're staying out there. And in Northern California, the action today is on the campus of UC Berkeley, where they've continued to hold protests and actions. But if you were an investor, would you wish that you could go long police raids right about now? I mean, looking at these, factoring in the militarization of local police forces across the country since 9/11? Well, we're pretty sure you can't. So we'll ask who does stand to benefit from this. And we'll speak more extensively, too, with just the man to answer these questions, Lou Rockwell. He's chairman of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And it's really nice to see you. Thanks for being on the show, Mr. Rockwell.
Great to be with you.
Now, we always talk economics for very obvious reasons, but you have a political history, so I'm really curious to get your insight on this, because you were politically active in the 1960s. So I'm curious, how would you compare the climate then to the climate today with these Occupy Wall Street protests?
Well, we have, as you indicate, a growing police state in this country. And we call these people riot police. They're actually rioting police. I mean, they're the ones who are inflicting the violence. And they're doing, under the direction of the central government, exactly what the U.S. always criticizes other countries for. That is beating, rousting, jailing anti-government demonstrators. So these demonstrators are not only anti-government, but they're anti-bank. And since the American government is sort of a bankocracy, that's who benefits from rousting these people out. At least in the short term, I think that the economic conditions in this country are going to dictate, even though the poor Occupy Wall Street people don't know much economics, I think the conditions are going to dictate we're going to have many more demonstrations, much more civil disturbances, much more civil disobedience. And it's because of the way the government handles things. Then there are going to be more crackdowns. So, we're even potentially in a pre-revolutionary situation as the economy gets worse, as inflation is going to go through the roof. Everything that the banks and the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and the Obama administration, the Congress, the Republicans too, this is not just a partisan matter. They're crushing these people. Most of these kids in Occupy are recent college graduates. They can't get a job. They've also got huge debts. So they've been made into debt slaves by the government and by the banks. They are scared for their futures. Who can blame them? It is scary.
Well, and you bring up
these are victims.
And you bring up some really good points, and you brought up their understanding of economics, which today's kind of the first day that I've seen on some of the mainstream news networks them dedicate all of a sudden a lot of coverage to Occupy Wall Street with this camp in Wall Street being broken up. And so you saw the opportunity of some of these Wall Street guys to respond, and they were just kind of berating the protesters as not understanding economics, as they saw sitting on Wall Street or not understanding Wall Street. My question is, okay, I'm not judging the protesters because I've heard them say some very, very knowledgeable intellectual things and shown an understanding of the situation in this country. But regardless of that, does that matter? Does what matter the fact that they are out there and that they're that angry and upset and affected by the economic conditions in this country?
Well, first of all, it's bankonomics that the mainstream media and the Wall Street economists, the bankers and so forth, are propagating. It's no more real economics than what the Occupy Wall Street people say. So it's just, what the bankers and all their allies are saying is, how dare you try to shrug us off your shoulder? It's our right to ride you, to control you, to run your life, take your money, and make you do whatever we want. So these kids say, no, it's not. And, one has to be with them in that. I again wish they would read Ludwig von Mises and some of their other great Austrian economists, listen to Ron Paul and people of that sort. But still, I think the whole thing is healthy. We need protests. We need people being angry. Anger is good when you're being ripped off, and we are all being ripped off by the banks, by the government, and by the Federal Reserve and that whole complex, the financial industrial complex, however we would describe it. And of course the warfare state and all the many other horrible things the government engages in, killing people en masse and so forth. So this is economically, besides all the corpses that the government generates around the world, this is economically disastrous for the American people. The rich, of course, are doing fine, the government-connected rich. They always do fine. But the rest of us are being crushed. They've got their boot on our throat. And the fact that people are trying to remove that boot, well, I think it's a good thing.
Okay, and I like how you put that, the financial industrial complex. But just to ask you one more thing, because you bring up your assertion of this as a police state, I want to know how you compare the reaction of the police now to what are peaceful protests, these Occupy Wall Street protests, to the police reaction to violent riots of the 60s.
Well, I don't think the police have ever been a bunch of libertarians, let's put it that way. But ever since really began with the Nixon administration in the early 1970s, there's been a gradual federal takeover and federal militarization of the police. And today, virtually all police forces, by federal edict and subsidy, want to hire veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan and the other American wars that are going on. People who are trained to think of civilians as terrorists or potential terrorists, no sympathy for them, and tend to pull out the nightstick or the taser or the gun rather than trying to settle disputes. They're not peace officers, as they laughingly call themselves, but they're pro-riot, it's very, very different. So this is another alarming situation. The cops are much more brutal than they used to be. All the tasering and so forth. Will eventually we see some of these demonstrators shot and killed? They're using rubber bullets already. Will they start to use metal bullets? I must say I'm terrified of that.
Wow. And speaking of tasers and speaking of the weapons and the rubber bullets and this increasing police force, who benefits or capitalizes on this? Because as I mentioned, if you're an investor, maybe you'd want to invest in this kind of action, police, long police raids, which obviously you can't, but I got to imagine somebody benefits here.
Well, sure. I mean, the government benefits and all the economic interests associated with the government. If I can quote, Malcolm X used to say that police forces are occupiers, they're occupying forces, in effect occupying military forces. I think that's correct. I mean, they are there to enforce the will of the government and its associated economic interests against the rest of us. And if anybody protests, why they want to take care of you, take you out. So that's who they're working for. They're not working for the people. They're not in favor of peaceful cooperation, that sort of thing. They want obedience, fear, humiliation, control. It's the same same thing they do with the X-ray machines at the airport and feeling people up and so forth. They want to humiliate us, control us, and make us just kiss their feet. Some people are not willing to kiss their feet.
And speaking of kissing their feet, the Federal Reserve's feet are certainly some that you do not kiss. So I have to ask your question about this, because we saw the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's president say that the Fed should commit to near zero interest rates until unemployment either goes below 7% or inflation goes above 3%. So let's assume that inflation remains below 3%. Could this help unemployment?
Well, first of all, inflation is way above 3%. You can't believe the government statistics. They lie in that as in everything else. Employment is far higher, for example, than they say it is. And this is just crazy Keynesianism. I mean, it's the most vulgar, ridiculous form of Keynesianism that sees the economy as unable to run itself. Government has to be in charge of everything. And they can fool everybody by just manufacturing all this newly created money. So all it does is make us poorer. Of course, the banks benefit, the government benefits, but the vast majority of people are made poorer by monetary depreciation. This guy is, of course, calling for even more monetary depreciation, and Bernanke is already the biggest inflator in the entire world, far more, for example, than the European Central Bank or the Bank of Japan. So he's saying, well, really, they should just print out that money more and depreciate the dollar. Let's have hyperinflation. Let's all be Weimar or Zimbabwe. That's what this guy's position is. And then, of course, he'll be for price and wage controls, capital controls, and the financial totalitarian state. So this is the corporate state at work, the combination of big business, big government together, or fascism, as we can also call it, in operation, cracking heads, cracking down on our standards of living, making things much worse. And we definitely need some opposition, and I think, as I've said before, I think we're seeing some opposition. It may be very imperfect opposition, but boy, whatever's wrong with Occupy Wall Street and the people who oppose the Federal Reserve, the End the Fed movement and so forth, and I don't think there's anything wrong, by the way, with the End the Fed movement, but they're so much more virtuous than the government. I mean, the government, let's not forget, is engaged in killing people all the time.
You bring up really good points. I wanted to get to Iran. We don't have time, unfortunately. We're up against the end of the show, but hopefully we'll bring you on again to talk about that, because we so appreciate having you on. That was Lew Rockwell, chairman of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And that is all we have time for, but please feel free to follow me on Twitter at Lauren Lister and check out youtube.com/capitalaccount to keep it going, because you can see the rest of my interview with Nigel Farage there. Until next time, have a great night.